You do not lose 268 soldiers in under an hour to warriors you outnumber and outgun. But on June 25, 1876, that's exactly what happened. And the U.S. Army couldn't explain it, couldn't understand it, couldn't accept that everything they knew about fighting indigenous peoples was catastrophically wrong. For decades, U.S. military doctrine operated on one unshakable principle: disciplined formations beat undisciplined warriors. Always. The cavalry manual was clear: maintain unit cohesion, concentrate firepower, use superior weapons and training to break enemy resistance. Native American forces were expected to scatter when facing organized military units. They'd done so for decades. From the Indian Wars of the 1830s through the Sand Creek Massacre, through Red Cloud's War, the pattern held. When cavalry charged, indigenous warriors broke and ran. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 500 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales of history matter. Please subscribe, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now let's continue. The mathematics seemed unassailable. The 7th U.S. Cavalry carried Springfield carbines that could kill at 300 yards. They had military training, standardized tactics, and the discipline that came from professional soldiering. The Lakota and Cheyenne had bows, some old rifles, and what Army officers dismissively called wild Indian fighting. Individual combat without organization or strategy. Superior technology plus superior training equaled inevitable victory. That was the rule. That was what every officer from West Point to Fort Abraham Lincoln believed as gospel truth. Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer believed it so completely that he split his forces in the face of an enemy of unknown size, refused additional troops, and rode toward the largest gathering of indigenous warriors in North American history with 600 soldiers. He expected glory. He expected another victory to add to his reputation. He expected the Lakota and Cheyenne to do what they'd always done: see the cavalry coming and scatter. Instead, he got annihilated. But this isn't Custer's story. Everyone knows Custer died at Little Bighorn. What they don't know is how. The specific tactics that destroyed his command so completely that it shocked the entire U.S. military establishment. What they don't know is that one of Custer's company commanders, an Irish immigrant who'd fought in the Papal States and the Civil War, who'd survived some of the bloodiest battles in American history, died on a Montana hillside trying to understand tactics he'd never encountered in any military manual. His name was Captain Miles Keogh, and in his final hour, he would face a form of warfare that made everything he'd learned about combat utterly obsolete. The question that would haunt military investigators for decades was simple and terrifying. How did warriors with inferior weapons systematically destroy cavalry companies that should have crushed them? The answer would force the U.S. Army to rewrite every assumption about indigenous warfare. But that understanding came too late for Keogh and the 268 men who died with him. Before we reveal what happened on that hillside, if you're already fascinated by this forgotten piece of military history, hit that subscribe button now. Because what you're about to hear will change everything you think you know about the Battle of Little Bighorn. Act 2, the context. Captain Miles Walter Keogh is 36 years old on June 25, 1876. That matters because he's not some green lieutenant fresh from the academy. Keogh is a veteran of 3 separate wars on 2 continents. Born in County Carlow, Ireland in 1840, he fought for the Papal States in Italy before immigrating to America and enlisting in the Union Army in 1862. His Civil War record is distinguished. He fights at Gettysburg, the Wilderness, and over a dozen other major engagements. He's wounded twice, promoted for bravery, and personally commended by Major General George McClellan. He knows warfare. He understands tactics. He's survived battles where thousands died. After the war, he transfers to the 7th Cavalry as a company commander. He's been fighting on the Great Plains for 11 years by 1876. He's participated in campaigns against the Cheyenne, the Kiowa, the Comanche. He's not naive about indigenous warfare. He knows Plains warriors are formidable opponents. But even Keogh, even with all his experience, operates under the fundamental assumption that disciplined cavalry will prevail against undisciplined warriors if they maintain formation and concentrate firepower. The broader context of June 1876 is critical. The U.S. government has ordered all Lakota and Cheyenne peoples onto reservations. Many have complied. But thousands, somewhere between 3,000 and 8,000 Native Americans, have gathered in the valleys along the Little Bighorn River in Montana Territory. They're hunting buffalo. They're practicing traditional ways. They're refusing to submit. The military calls them hostiles. The government calls them treaty violators. In reality, they're families trying to preserve their way of life for one more summer before the inevitable confinement of reservation existence. Among those thousands are somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 warriors, Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho fighters led by chiefs like Crazy Horse, Gall, and Two Moon. They're not massed for war. They're scattered across miles of camps along the river. But they're prepared to defend their families if the cavalry attacks. Lieutenant Colonel Custer commands the 7th Cavalry, approximately 650 soldiers. His orders are to locate the hostile camp and engage. On June 25th, Crow Scouts report a massive village ahead. Custer makes a fateful decision. He'll split his regiment into 3 battalions to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. Captain Frederick Benteen takes 125 men on a reconnaissance to the south. Major Marcus Reno takes 140 men to attack the southern end of the village. Custer takes 210 men, including Miles Keogh's I Company of 40 soldiers, to attack from the north and east. It's standard tactics for cavalry operations against indigenous peoples. Divide to create multiple threats, prevent the enemy from concentrating forces, hit them from unexpected directions. It's worked before. It should work now. At approximately 3:15 p.m., Reno's battalion attacks the southern camps. The battle begins. Custer's battalion, including Keogh's company, rides north along the ridgeline paralleling the river. They're moving to attack the northern end of the village, while Reno occupies the warriors' attention to the south. Keogh rides with his company in the center of Custer's formation. They're confident. They're experienced. They're about to die. Because what none of them understand, what Custer doesn't understand, what Reno doesn't understand, what the entire military establishment doesn't understand, is that the Lakota and Cheyenne have developed tactics specifically designed to destroy cavalry formations. Tactics that exploit every weakness of military doctrine. Tactics that turn discipline into a liability and training into a death trap. At 3:30 p.m., Custer's battalion crests a ridge and sees the village. It's enormous, stretching 3 miles along the river valley, thousands of lodges, more people than any of them have ever seen in one place. For a moment, the officers realize they've made a catastrophic miscalculation about the size of the opposing force. But it's too late to withdraw. Reno is already engaged to the south. The only option is to attack and hope their training and firepower can overcome the numerical disparity. Custer orders the advance. 210 soldiers riding down toward a village containing 1,500 warriors and thousands of women and children who can also fight if necessary. The Lakota and Cheyenne response isn't panic. It's coordinated. Warriors pour out of the camps, not in mass charges, but in small groups moving independently, using terrain, spreading wide to envelope the cavalry flanks. Keogh watches it happen. He's seen indigenous warriors fight before, but this is different. There's no single leader shouting orders. No organized formation. Yet the warriors move with perfect coordination, like water flowing around rocks, finding every gap in the cavalry line. This is decentralized warfare refined through generations. Every warrior knows what to do without being told. They know the terrain, every ravine, every depression, every fold in the ground that can provide cover. They know to spread wide, to never mass into targets, to keep moving so the cavalry can't concentrate fire. And they know to kill the horses. Act 3, the impossible action. At 3:45 p.m., Custer's battalion reaches a ridgeline 400 yards from the village. He orders a dismount, standard cavalry procedure when facing defensive positions. Every 4th man holds horses while the others form firing lines. 210 soldiers become 158 shooters. The Lakota and Cheyenne warriors number over 1,000 at this point. More are arriving every minute as word spreads through the camps that the cavalry is attacking. But they don't charge en masse. They flow forward in small groups. 10 warriors here, 20 there, using ravines and low ground to approach within 100 yards of the cavalry line. They fire, withdraw, reposition. Other groups attack from different angles. The cavalry can't concentrate fire because threats emerge from everywhere simultaneously. Keogh's I Company holds the center of the line. 40 soldiers firing Springfield carbines that can kill at 300 yards. But the warriors never present mass targets. They're individuals using terrain, moving constantly, making themselves nearly impossible to hit. The cavalry fires volley after volley. They're hitting nothing. The warriors are hitting horses and men with increasing frequency. At 4 p.m., 15 minutes into the engagement, Custer realizes they cannot hold this position. Warriors are infiltrating around both flanks. The cavalry is being surrounded. He orders a fighting withdrawal to higher ground, a ridgeline 800 yards to the north that offers better defensive terrain. This is where tactics become execution. To withdraw while under fire requires discipline, coordination, and careful movement. The cavalry has trained for this. They know the procedure. They should be able to execute it successfully. But the Lakota and Cheyenne have seen this before. They know what cavalry does when it withdraws, and they've developed the perfect counter. As Custer's battalion moves toward the higher ground, warriors surge forward from multiple directions, not charging into the cavalry, but pressing close, within 75 yards, maintaining constant fire. The cavalry can't stop to return fire without being overrun. They can't maintain formation while moving over broken terrain. The organized withdrawal deteriorates into clusters of men trying to reach safety. Keogh's company becomes separated from the rest of the battalion. 40 soldiers moving as a unit, but the terrain, rolling hills cut by ravines, breaks line of sight with other companies. For critical minutes, a company is isolated. A Lakota war chief named Gall sees the separation. He directs approximately 150 warriors to concentrate on Keogh's isolated company. Not a frontal assault, that would cost too many lives. Instead, warriors move through ravines to position themselves on 3 sides of I Company's line of march. Keogh recognizes the danger. He orders his men to form a defensive perimeter on a small rise. The horses are brought into the center. The soldiers form a circle facing outward, the standard cavalry response to being surrounded. It's 4:12 p.m. Keogh has 40 men, approximately 20 rounds of ammunition per soldier, and no reinforcements coming. Around him, perhaps 200 warriors are positioning themselves in the ravines and depressions within 100 yards of his position. The siege begins. Not mass charges, just constant pressure from multiple directions. Warriors fire from cover, force the cavalry to expend ammunition returning fire at targets they can barely see, then withdraw and reposition. Other warriors move closer during the lulls, reducing the range, making every shot count. The cavalry is trained to fight this way. Defensive formations, concentrated firepower, holding position until relief arrives. It's doctrine. It's what every manual teaches. But relief isn't coming. And the doctrine doesn't account for an enemy that refuses to mass into targets, that uses terrain better than the cavalry uses their weapons, that can coordinate attacks without visible leadership. At 4:25 p.m., warriors begin targeting horses systematically. The animals are larger targets than men, easier to hit. A horse screams as an arrow strikes its hindquarters. Another goes down from a rifle shot. Then another. The cavalry needs those horses to escape if withdrawal becomes possible. Without horses, they're infantry trapped on an exposed hillside. Soldiers shoot horses to create defensive barriers, the cavalry manual's last resort. Dead horses provide cover when no natural cover exists. 40 soldiers crouch behind the bodies of their own mounts, firing at enemies they can barely see. The temperature is over 90 degrees. The soldiers are wearing wool uniforms. They're thirsty. Canteens were emptied hours ago during the approach march. The nearest water is the Little Bighorn River, 400 yards away, controlled by thousands of hostile warriors. Keogh knows his men are dying. Not from one decisive assault, but from accumulated wounds. A bullet here, an arrow there, constant attrition from an enemy that won't expose themselves to concentrated fire. At 4:35 p.m., approximately 300 yards to the north, the rest of Custer's battalion is being systematically destroyed using identical tactics. Companies C, E, F, L, each isolated, each surrounded, each being worn down by warriors who understand that patience kills more effectively than bravery. If you find this kind of forgotten history as fascinating as we do, we'd be honored if you'd hit that subscribe button. We believe these stories of tactical genius deserve to be told. And by subscribing, you help us ensure they aren't forgotten. Keogh's defensive perimeter shrinks as men fall. 40 soldiers become 35. 35 become 30. The circle contracts. The fire slackens as ammunition runs low. Soldiers are spacing their shots now, trying to make every round count. At 4:50 p.m., warriors sense the moment. The cavalry fire has become sporadic. The defense is collapsing. Groups of warriors rush forward from multiple directions. Not one coordinated charge, but separate simultaneous attacks that split defensive attention. Hand-to-hand combat erupts across I Company's position. Soldiers swing carbines as clubs when they run out of ammunition. They draw pistols and fire point-blank. Some pull knives for final desperate defense. Keogh dies on this hillside, surrounded by his men. The exact moment isn't recorded. No one survives to document it. But when army burial parties find his body 3 days later, he's lying among 28 soldiers of I Company, all dead within a 30-yard radius. His company fought together. They died together. 400 yards north, the same scene repeats with Custer and the remaining companies. By 5 p.m., less than 90 minutes after the fighting began, every soldier in Custer's battalion is dead. 210 men annihilated. Major Reno's battalion, fighting 3 miles to the south, survives barely. They retreat to a defensive position on high ground and endure a 2-day siege. They lose 53 killed and 60 wounded from an original force of 140. They survive only because Lakota and Cheyenne warriors choose to break off the attack after destroying Custer's command. The Lakota and Cheyenne losses are estimated between 40 and 100 warriors killed. Sources vary wildly, and indigenous accounts deliberately minimize casualty numbers to prevent U.S. forces from claiming victory through body counts. But the casualty ratio doesn't matter. What matters is that in 90 minutes, using tactics the U.S. Army didn't understand and couldn't counter, indigenous warriors destroyed 5 companies of the 7th Cavalry so completely that investigators initially couldn't comprehend what happened. Act 4. The Ripple Effect. News of the defeat reaches the East Coast on July 4th, 1876, America's centennial celebration. The timing is catastrophic for national morale. While the country celebrates 100 years of independence, reports arrive that an entire cavalry battalion has been wiped out by the very peoples the government claimed were nearly defeated. The initial military response is denial. Custer must have made tactical errors. His officers must have failed to execute properly. The defeat must be explicable through individual mistakes rather than systemic failure. But as investigators examine the battlefield, interview survivors from Reno's battalion, and piece together what happened, a disturbing picture emerges. The Lakota and Cheyenne didn't win through lucky ambush or numerical superiority alone. They won through superior tactics specifically designed to counter cavalry doctrine. The investigations reveal principles that military textbooks said shouldn't work. Decentralized command. The Lakota and Cheyenne had no single battlefield commander giving orders. Each warrior made independent decisions based on training and situational awareness. Yet they achieved perfect coordination. How? The U.S. Army couldn't explain it. Terrain exploitation. The warriors used every depression, every ravine, every fold in the ground to approach within effective range while remaining nearly invisible. They knew that landscape better than the cavalry knew their own weapons. Systematic targeting. The warriors killed horses first, infantry second, officers if possible. They understood cavalry mobility depended on horses. Without mounts, cavalry became vulnerable infantry. Patience in combat. Rather than massing for decisive charges that would expose them to concentrated fire, the warriors maintained pressure from multiple directions, wearing down defenders through attrition. These weren't savage tactics. They were sophisticated military doctrine that exploited every weakness of cavalry formations. And they'd been refined through generations of warfare against Spanish, French, Mexican, and American forces. What they didn't know was that Little Bighorn would be the high-water mark of Plains Indian military success. The shock of Custer's defeat triggers a massive military response. Within a year, the U.S. Army floods the plains with reinforcements. Columns of soldiers systematically hunt down and force every Lakota and Cheyenne band onto reservations. The true impact wouldn't be understood until decades later, when military historians analyzed the battle and recognized that indigenous tactics at Little Bighorn demonstrated principles of modern infantry combat. Fire and movement, use of cover and concealment, decentralized leadership, exploitation of terrain. These concepts wouldn't be formally adopted by the U.S. Army until World War I, 40 years after Lakota warriors used them to annihilate a cavalry battalion. General Philip Sheridan, commanding the military division of the Missouri, writes in his official report, "The hostiles demonstrated tactical capabilities we did not credit them with possessing. Their coordination without apparent command structure, their use of terrain, and their systematic exploitation of our tactical weaknesses suggest a level of military sophistication that requires fundamental reassessment of our approach to plains warfare." That reassessment leads to major changes in U.S. military doctrine for fighting indigenous peoples. Large cavalry formations are broken into smaller, more mobile units. Frontal assaults are abandoned in favor of siege tactics and winter campaigns that attack villages when they're most vulnerable. The Army stops assuming indigenous warriors will scatter when facing organized forces. But the changes come too late to help the 268 soldiers who died on June 25, 1876. They died because their training, their doctrine, and their assumptions about warfare were obsolete the moment they faced an enemy who'd spent generations perfecting tactics to defeat exactly the kind of formations cavalry doctrine required. Act 5, The Legacy. Captain Miles Keogh's body is found on June 27, 1876, 2 days after the battle. He's lying on a hillside with 28 soldiers of I Company around him. Unlike most of the dead, Keogh's body hasn't been mutilated. Lakota accounts later explain that warriors saw a Catholic medallion around his neck, an Agnus Dei medal blessed by Pope Pius IX, and considered him protected by spiritual power. His horse, Comanche, is found wounded but alive, the only living thing from Custer's battalion to survive the battle. The Army retires Comanche with full military honors. The horse lives until 1891, appearing at 7th Cavalry ceremonies, a living reminder of what happened at Little Bighorn. Keogh is 36 years old when he dies. He's buried at Fort Leavenworth National Cemetery. His headstone reads simply, Captain M.W. Keogh, 7th U.S. Cavalry, killed at Little Bighorn, June 25, 1876. The other soldiers of I Company, men like Sergeant James Bustard, Corporal John Foley, Private James Kelly, are buried in a mass grave on the battlefield, later reinterred at Little Bighorn National Cemetery. Most of their families never learn exactly how they died. The official reports say only that they fell in battle against hostile Indians. The Lakota and Cheyenne warriors who fought at Little Bighorn scatter after their victory. They know the U.S. Army will respond with overwhelming force. Sitting Bull leads his followers into Canada. Crazy Horse continues fighting until his surrender and death in 1877. Gall surrenders in 1881 and lives on the Standing Rock Reservation until 1894. The survivors carry memories of the battle, stories passed down through families, preserved in oral histories. They remember it not as a great victory, but as a desperate defense of their families against an army that wanted to imprison them on reservations. They remember warriors who died. Men like Lame White Man killed fighting Custer's soldiers, whose body was found dressed for battle, painted and ready. The tactical lessons from Little Bighorn influence U.S. military training for decades. The concept of small unit tactics, decentralized command, and terrain exploitation that dominated World War I and World War II infantry doctrine. These have roots in the analysis of what happened on that Montana hillside in 1876. Modern military historians recognize Little Bighorn as a textbook example of how mobility, terrain knowledge, and adaptive tactics can defeat technologically superior forces. Special Operations Forces study the battle not as a curiosity, but as a case study in asymmetric warfare. The broader legacy extends beyond tactics. Little Bighorn represents the moment when the myth of inevitable U.S. military superiority over indigenous peoples was shattered. It proved that technology and training don't guarantee victory when facing an enemy who understands their environment and has refined their tactics through generations of warfare. To this day, Little Bighorn National Cemetery stands in Montana, preserving the battlefield where 268 soldiers died. White markers dot the hillsides where men fell. The names are recorded: Keogh, Custer, Harrington, Calhoun, and 264 others. For decades, only U.S. casualties were memorialized. In 2003, the National Park Service added markers honoring the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors who fell defending their families. The names include Lame White Man, Noisy Walking, Long Road, and dozens of others whose sacrifice deserves equal recognition. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. Every click tells the algorithm this piece of history is worth remembering. We're dedicated to rescuing these forgotten stories from the archives. If you want to join us on this mission, please subscribe and turn on notifications. The soldiers of the 7th Cavalry and the warriors of the Lakota and Cheyenne nations both displayed courage in a conflict neither side could ultimately win. One side fighting for empire, the other for survival. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment with your city or state, and tell us if you have connections to military families or to the Lakota and Cheyenne nations. These stories connect us across time, reminding us that tactical genius exists in every culture, that courage isn't confined to one side of any conflict. Thank you for ensuring that Captain Miles Keogh and the 40 soldiers of I Company, 7th U.S. Cavalry, do not disappear into silence. Thank you for honoring the Lakota and Cheyenne warriors whose tactical brilliance won the battle but couldn't stop the inevitable tide of American expansion. Thank you for remembering that on June 25, 1876, 268 soldiers died facing an enemy whose tactics they couldn't understand. Tactics that were, in many ways, decades ahead of their time. They all deserve to be remembered.